So today we're starting with a very exciting panel. I think that I believe that this is going to set the tone for this conference, but also for the coming 2 years. I think that an alliance that has been delayed for too long is the alliance between First Nations and ecological economics in terms of methods, theory, and how to move forward. And I think with that we have to take the opportunity of this panel and this conference to bring this topic to the next level and also engage in a broader discussion. So, having said that, we initially had 3 fantastic panelists. Unfortunately, Ronald Trosper, he's stuck in the U.S. in the airport. However, we have 2 fantastic panelists, Susan Paulson and Eriel Deranger. And for Susan, would you like to introduce Susan?
Sure.
Go for
well, you get your mic on.
Oh, do I need
yes,
that?
yes, you do. It's for the friends at home, the friends elsewhere. So Susan Paulson is the academic director of Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. And she has lived for 15 years in South America and 5 years in Europe. So she has been doing cross-cultural dialogue and multi-forum collaborative initiatives for a long time. She recently hosted a conference on buen vivir and other post-development pathways in Florida with participants from 30 countries. And her recent publications explore degrowth, pluriverse, and masculinities and environment. I heard Susan speak in Mexico recently at the International Society for Ecological Economics conference, and she was dynamite. So we're lucky to have her here today. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Susan. And no, I wanna take this. Thank you, Susan.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Joel. Can everyone hear me all right? Welcome. I love this great team. A lot of positive energy, and it's good we're together because our worlds need radical transformation to reestablish livelihoods, relationships, politics around well-being, not growth. People gathered here are working in many ways toward that transformation, changing economic institutions, broadening epistemological horizons, experimenting with livelihoods, communities. So I want to talk about something that brings all those together, which is altering the systems through which humans and their worlds are produced, sustained, and adapted. How can we bring into question ethnic, gender, economic systems that currently entrenched as natural? How can we forge systems that produce healthier worlds? To start with, we can think about shifting our paradigms. We can broaden the span of human possibility that we're paying attention to. In addition to looking at individual humans, we can look at the systems that produce and reproduce different types of humans. And instead of just using ethnicity and gender to label people, we can think about them as dynamic and generative systems that shape all actors and their worlds. This paradigm shift illuminates a broader range of empirical realities, things that are often left out of studies of economists, of ecologists, etc. It also raises questions about ecological economics' focus on the relationships between society and nature conceived as different things. I'm going to push you to think about every aspect of the human world as 100% biophysical and 100% socially meaningful. Even the most abstract human thought, poetry, fantasy, economic theory, is grounded in cerebral cortex that changes through neuroplasticity in relationship with communities and with environments. And even the most physical human actions, eating, pooping, sex, are governed by symbolic meanings and cultural practices that build muscle memory into ourselves. Who here has ever hooked up with someone that says, "Oh, it's just sex, it doesn't mean anything"? Don't believe it. Even Allison, could you help, please? I'd like you to pass around these cultural artifacts. Even erotic response is inseparably physical and meaningful. As you feel, touch, try on these artifacts, some things are going to happen. Pass it around. Some temperatures will rise slightly, heartbeats will get a little bit faster, nether regions may wake up. This is real biophysical response, and it feels like instinct. Just like that urge to buy and the drive to compete, they feel like instinct in your body. But the ideology convinces us that because it's instinctually feeling, that it's determined by biology. It's simply not true. These things have nothing to do with biological evolution. They're contemporary items, right? So if we accept that things are biologically determined, we lose the courage to transform. So to support change, I propose we focus on systems conceived as inseparably social and eco-social systems. As Kelly just explained to us, humans are the most pitiful family of creatures on Earth. Thank you. Individual Homo sapiens are poorly equipped to meet their own needs or assure their survival of their descendants. Selfish hoarding, competitive individualism, desire to control property are not hardwired survival instincts. These behaviors were fostered in recent history to advance the expansion of specific economic systems. The evolutionary feature that has assured survival throughout a much longer lifetime is our biophysical capacity for symbolic thought and communication that enables groups of humans to collaboratively develop languages, religions, kinship, other systems that survive the individual organism and that produce new generation of humans, their habits, and their habitats. These systems are our most fundamental commons. Today we're going to think about interactions among three of them: gender, ethnicity, and economy. None of these three systems is by definition equitable or inequitable, just or unjust, sustainable or unsustainable. These are historical questions that need to be asked of specific context. During 30 years of research in the Andes, I explored ways in which gender and ethnic identities and relations produce interconnected, diverse techniques, responsibilities, species, spaces, eco-niches, and forms of reciprocity and exchange, all in ways that assured and enabled resilience and adaptation to changing environments. These Andean eco-social systems, like others around the world, have been altered through time via contact with distinct systems that emerged in Europe during the Capitalocene, an era that dawned 5 centuries ago with the expansion of capitalism, colonialism, and Western science. For some 200,000 years, we humans have been walking around, talking, thinking, making all kinds of identities and relationships. Some of them led to collapse, and some of them evolved and continued over millennia. In the Capitalocene, ethnic and gender systems were adapted to facilitate an astonishing expansion of industrial economies and ecological footprints. Two key mechanisms in this process demonstrate what Jessica Dempsey will analyze tomorrow as accumulation by difference making. The first one is appropriation through racialization. Difference has been expressed in all kinds of ways: ethno-linguistic, ethno-religious, ethno-national, etc. In the Capitalocene, a new form of difference-making came about that's called racialization. It specifically explains difference as if it was determined by biology, using the language of Western science. The development and employment of racialization as a technology for accessing human and other resources for the purpose of accumulation is intensely relevant for ecological economics. In the Americas, Europeans and their descendants exercised a variety of gender ethnic policies and arrangements that supported the appropriation of land, labor, other resources from people identified as other, and that managed to reproduce these inequalities over generations. These systems are still being reproduced, adapted, and resisted. I've been studying how ethno-racial systems interact with gender and class systems to produce subordinate masculinities as beasts of burden and cannon fodder in expanding economies in Latin America. The second mechanism we're going to look at, is called gendered hierarchization of productive and reproductive realms. Some gender systems operate through multiple categories, others are binary, some are complementary, some are hierarchical. Features associated with patriarchy and heteronormativity operate in varied contexts today, but they don't characterize the majority of gender systems. Again, as Kelly pointed out, in her own family, patrilineal and patriarchal systems aren't what manages kin and human resources. Through 95% of human history, matrilineal kinship and matrilocal residence were the most common ways for us to organize ourselves. So it's only since the emergence of agricultural life, agricultural revolution, that we've begun to develop, some people, this patriarchy systems, right? Even more recent is manliness through money earning. As market relations sought to replace community and feudal traditions in early modern Europe, neither men nor women were easily persuaded to sell their labor for money. Forms of coercion ranged from enclosing the commons to chaining people to the looms. Models that finally did capture labor ran into crises of sustainability that offer increasingly important lessons for us today. The intense exploitation of man, women's, and children's labor caused problems: illness, disability, death. Most importantly, people didn't find it, they were either unwilling or incapable to do the productive labor for profit and reproduce themselves by raising and nourishing other generations of workers. So Silvia Federici and others have uncovered a violent historical process that established women as these sort of machines of reproduction that would reproduce the whole family labor every day through food, through care, through health care, through clothing, and would also reproduce generations as part of the system. But to complete the model, we also need to look at how men came to be produced as machines of market value. That wasn't a given thing. What happened was this system emerged that divided two things that should be inseparable. Divided production from reproduction, identified production as masculine, reproduction as feminine, and then attributed greater monetary and other value to production, to manly production, right? That's a new way of gendering. Labor evolved together with markets, nuclear family, and also the portrayal of sexual dimorphism as the natural basis of economies, right? That was a new kind of scientific idea that emerged. So in sum, gender division of human energies into production versus reproduction is not natural, it's not universal, and it's not even very old. Institutionalized only during the Capitalocene, the model began to expand in the 20th century when national and international development programs convinced people to see the model as not only desirable but natural and universal. Generations of children learn that the basic economic unit from the Stone Age to the supersonic future is a nuclear heterosexual family with the adult man going out to earn cash, the adult woman doing the unpaid domestic labor, and a pet dinosaur or dog defending the private property unifamily dwelling, right? That's the way humanity exists. Well, aspects of this mode have been critiqued by feminist activists who decry the barriers for women to get access to productive resources, powers, prestige, etc. And in fact, a ton of effort has gone in the late 20th century into empowering women by getting them into the workplace. In Latin America alone, 70 million women were added to the paid workforce in 30 years, right? And it's an enormous change following the stated goals of promoting equal rights between men and women, which obscure deeper drives to harness more and cheaper labor to accelerate economic growth. So what's come of this dangerous liaison between feminist goals and pro-growth impulses? Liberal focus on women as individuals rather than integral analysis of gendered reproductive systems has provoked massive moves of women into paid work with no financial, political, intellectual support for shifts in masculine roles, nor for reproductive or care work. Outcomes have been pretty contradictory, as you all know, right? Women's entry into the workforce has also been blamed for all kinds of consequences: divorce, delinquency, drug abuse, community disintegration. Violence aimed at pushing women back into the still undervalued reproductive realm is seen through hostility and abuse in the workforce that we're learning about through the Me Too movement, also through reduction of reproductive health that we're seeing as sex education and abortion rights are being pulled back, and these other things going on. So one force fueling these reactions is a cry by men that I think is very understandable. Paid work is the main route to manliness. I can't be virile unless I defend my workplace against feminization. I understand if that's the only option that men have as money value has gained prominence over other valuations. Routes to manliness have gotten more and more narrow. Politicians, curricula, media are telling men to push all their drives and desires into economic growth. So we've only begun to realize the extent to which this push has undermined long-evolving arrangements to regenerate human worlds. So as ecological economics, how can we help to imagine and build healthier systems? One route is to look back, return to oikonomia. Many of you are familiar with a much deeper pre-market understanding of economics as managing of households and reproduction. The problem is that many contemporary contexts, men are trained to resist such initiatives as emasculating for selves and disastrous for nations. One way to enable change might be to make visible the cost to men of the Faustian bargain of masculine productivism. Statistical data reveal serious sacrifices for men. In every country in the world except Bhutan, where they have gross national happiness, men die much earlier than women do on average. It ranges from 13, this is not all the countries, but they all fit in this span, right? From 13 years to a year of difference. There's all kinds of factors go into that. I'm just going to share a few here. One of them has to do with violent damage and death. In every country, men suffer disproportionate homicides, suicides, assaults, occupational accidents, road accidents, gang, sport, military violence, etc. An important thing to note is that that violence is not distributed equally across manhood. In only 10% of the population in the Americas receive 50% of the violent homicides, right? And so we've got an intersection of race, of class, of different locations, education, that mean some men suffer much more than others. This is also true in education. We're always hearing how men earn more than women, men have more money than women, but if you look within men at something like the Gini coefficient, there's a much broader inequality than within women or within the economy as a whole, right? Some men are extremely wealthy and a lot of men are extremely impoverished. And so categorizing men as an economic group is not very useful. It's not a very useful empirical indicator, right? We have to break that down. Another thing that's been happening, I'm sure you all are aware of, is that women are far outstripping men in education. Again, this intersects with class, with race, with other things, but in 1980 already in North America, more women than men started going to college. The whole world, it was in 2000. So we've got generations now where more of the adult workers, women are much more educated than men. And this only goes to 2012. By 2019, there's numerous countries where 150 women are in university for every 100 men. These are interesting things. We have lots of stuff to ask about this question, and part of it has to do with the way men are being used, I think, in expanding production that we're going to get to. I just wanted to point out in the last 30 years or 40 years, there's been accelerations in the gaps, discriminating against men in terms of well-being, health, education, and we have to ask what that's coming from. In South America, it's grown even quicker than in the rest of the world, or in Latin America. We've now got a 6.5-year gap on average in life expectancy that's growing very quickly. So what's that about? In Latin America, a central motor of growth has been the expansion of extractive ventures that degrade environments and exacerbate climate change: mining, logging, petroleum, ranching, agro-industry. Ecological economists demonstrate the profitability of extracted ventures depends on unequal exchange of ecological and economic value. I also think that it depends on the ability to access certain type of human resource, strong, tough, and disposable beasts. Here they are. I've got a number of detailed examples, but I'm going to hold them to discuss later. Today, millions of men struggle to meet expectations of masculinity by performing underpaid work that is dangerous and destructive for themselves and their environments. Also, violent regimes of masculinity produce men as cannon fodder for conflicts in which elites, corporations, and state conscript poor men to fight against other poor men in squabbles over land, over oil, over roads, over water, and over other resources, right? That's some of the things that's happening in these, that we're seeing in these statistics. Efforts to turn away from this wave of extractivism will require changes in systems that reproduce humans. Currently, I'm studying, I'm working with listening to men in some different South American contexts to hear their stories about challenges they've suffered, their fathers and grandfathers before them, in trying to earn manliness in very difficult conditions. I'm also listening to some tell me about how they're trying to change expectations and norms for their sons and their grandsons. So, all right, 5 minutes left, perfect. Hierarchical masculinities produce unconscionable inequalities among some men and other men. But it is not only poor, less educated men of color whose health and well-being is jeopardized. Even successful men in wealthy countries are drawn into Faustian bargains in which vis-a-vis their women compatriots, they suffer far more bodily violence and premature death, including alcohol, drugs, suicide, heart attacks, etc. And they also cause much greater damage because of their gendered lifestyles. One example is meat. There's extensive studies showing meat. I mean, if you eat meat a lot, you're going to get cancer, type 2 diabetes, stroke, infection, whatever. We also know that meat production is a huge cost on the environment. And yet somehow, I'm suspecting it might have to do with the profitability of the cow, men are convinced that they will be more manly if they eat more meat, right? And I'm just going to share a magnificent little clip with you. In the 1970s, mature people remember this great feminist anthem, "I Am Woman." That was answered by the manthem to meat.
I am man, hear me roar. The number's too big to ignore, and I'm way too hungry to settle for chick food. 'Cause my stomach's starting to growl, and I'm going on the prowl for a pure beef double whopper, man, that's good. Oh yes, I'm a guy, I'll admit I've been fed quiche. Whey tofu, bye-bye, now it's for the purest beef I reach. I will eat this meat till my innie turns into an owie. I am starved, I am incorrigible, and I need to scarf 100% pure beef flame grill good thing down.
The double whopper. Man, that's a lot of meat.
Okay. So I propose that we start practicing a different cry. I'm going to invite you to say with me one of the alternative cries that we can make slowly and with feeling. You ready? Struggles to achieve masculinity in markets are destroying men and the environments that sustain them. Let's find healthier ways to feel virile. How about that? All right. So we're going to conclude with horizons for positive adaptations. To date, economic and ecological sciences have treated gender and ethnicity as pre-made categories to slap on people as labels. Meanwhile, activists and intellectuals concerned with ethnicity, race, and gender have engaged in tremendously creative ways with ecology and with economics. I'm just going to very quickly show you some images. Connections with these movements and these ideas offer magnificent opportunities for ecological economists to seek deeper understandings and more comprehensive actions. The global ascendancy of ecosocial systems instrumental to growth has led to an era of extreme inequality and Earth system degradation known as the Anthropocene. How can we mobilize healthier, more joyful, and sustainable lifeways for a wider range of humans and other beings? Today, focused on one front of thought and action, understanding and altering the systems through which socialized humans and their worlds are produced, sustained, and adapted. Unique biophysical characteristics, that big old noggin we have, interacting with wildly diverse sociocultural traditions, enable humans to imagine, communicate, and construct an endless variety of worlds. Now go to it.
Thank you so much, Susan, for such an inspiring talk. I feel virile now, a lot more virile. Let me introduce you to Eriel Deranger. She's a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and she's a mother of two, coming from a long time of Indigenous rights advocates fighting for the recognition and return of their full sovereignty and autonomy and what is known now as Canada. Deranger is the executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, an Indigenous-led climate justice organization working to empower communities and inspire Indigenous-led climate solutions. Indigenous Climate Action develops educational multimedia and contemporary climate change resources for Indigenous communities, curated and produced by Indigenous peoples. So let us please welcome Eriel to this panel. You have 30 minutes.
Eklanete, Dene sotlene Eriel Tchekwie hushe Deranger betsieni hesli. My name is Eriel Tchekwie Deranger, and I want to first acknowledge and give gratitude to the opening remarks and acknowledge the traditional territories in which we reside on today. I'm not an academic scholar. I'm an Indigenous person, an advocate for Indigenous rights, so my approach will be a bit different, and I will go through this presentation in a more storytelling narrative, as my ancestors did. And I'd like to start by sort of placing us in a different mood by opening with a spoken word piece that I wrote on the 150th anniversary of Canada. 150 years of being told how to act, how to use our lands, how to govern, how to learn, how to raise our children, how to build our communities, how to live, how to assimilate. My assimilation is broken because I still have an eagle feather and a smudge bowl. My assimilation is broken because I still know where I come from. My assimilation is broken because I know who my leaders are: the land, the water, the air, my ancestors on this earth. My assimilation is broken because my knowledge wasn't granted to me from an institution that left me out of its books. My assimilation is broken because my children have always been proud of who they are. My assimilation is broken because I can still hear the sounds that call me home. I can still see the northern lights guiding me to where I'm supposed to be. My assimilation is broken because I'm still here, standing here today. 150 years, and we still feel our ancestors in our blood, calling us to be proud, calling us to be strong, calling us to break down the walls of policy that have caged us in reservations, caged us in poverty, caged us in sickness, caged us in colonization. We are not broken. We have never been broken. We will decolonize, we will organize, we will become stronger, louder, and help each and every one of our brothers and sisters over the walls of oppression. We will stand up and return to our lands and territories. We will sing our songs and speak our languages. We will return to the sacredness of our peoples. 150 years, and we are breaking the systems that tried to break us. So I want us to sort of think about that. 150 years of colonization. And 150 years is the timeline we often think about. But Canada and the history of the continent of North America spans far, far greater than 150 years, and even greater than the 500 years of colonization on the Americas. And this is a map that was put together, but I want us to think about this country from a different perspective. Our territories were defined by our tribal lines, and not just through that, but each one of our territories came with it its own set of governance, our own languages, our own systems of education, our own systems of how we lived and traded amongst one another. There were pre-existing economies that existed in what is now known as Turtle Island, and this is just a rough map of looking at all the different centers and trade routes that existed across the continent. Indigenous peoples worldwide had their pre-existing economies, languages, systems of governance, and ways of being that predated colonial systems. And Indigenous peoples exist worldwide. There are roughly 5% of the global population, or roughly 370 million Indigenous peoples worldwide, and we encompass over 90 different countries with over 5,000 distinct languages and systems of governance. Of our people, we actually occupy more of the land space, and they occupy more of the Earth's surface, encompassing more than, well, this is like a debatable fact, but between 22 and 65% of the world's land surface is occupied and utilized by Indigenous peoples. And within those areas, we also encompass 80% of the world's biodiversity. That came along with the development of economic systems. So we can't say that economies cannot protect the environment. We had economic systems that predated colonial capitalist structures that we all are used to today. However, in Canada, we think of Canada and the foundations of our country starting at treaty. The treaties were supposed to be these beautiful agreements, like, look at this beautiful metal. We are partners, we're gonna share the land, it's gonna be beautiful. And unfortunately, you know, we look at the map now not in that way of looking at the Dene, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Thames. We don't look at it in the different territories, but we've relegated this pan-Indigenous framework and institutionalized treaties 1 through 11 and the pre-Confederation treaties, and we look at our history like that. I come from Treaty 8 territory, and so many people in my territory are like, I'm a Treaty 8 member. And I'm like, no, you're Dene. You're Dene Sotlene people. Our identities didn't start at colonization. Our identities predated that. And so when you think about what the treaties have actually amounted to, is that, I'm going to go back actually. So you think of the treaties, so these vast tracts of land were supposed to be shared in this previous slide, right? We're going to be sharing the land, we're going to be managing the resources, developing this country together, but instead what we have is this. The treaties have actually been devolved into this delegation of reserve systems across the country. We have reserves, and they only encompass about 0.2% of the land surface of Canada, and the other 99.8% is considered Crown land and under the jurisdiction of the government. So those economic systems and trade routes that we had, those intersections of our communities, our languages, our cultures, died when we were forced into reserve systems. These places that we come from are not merely just landscapes. The colonial name of my nation is the Athabasca Chippewan, which everyone always bastardizes, First Nation. And people are like, well, where'd that name come from? I'm always like, oh, those damn Crees. There's a really funny joke. Behind every tree, there is a Cree. But the Cree people named us, and they named us Chippewayan people because it means pointy skins. And because our clothes, and we're not like the rest of the people, we didn't have sort of long buckskin stuff. Our dresses and our clothes came down to points. It was just, to be honest, we were a little lazy in making our clothes. We're just like, let's be efficient. Let's not be decorative. And it was just easier to make pointed clothes, and so we were called pointy skins. But our actual name is Kaitale Dene Sotlene people. And Kaitale means of the land of the willow, and it's a direct reference to our place of origin, which is the Athabasca Delta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site situated just outside of Wood Buffalo National Park in northern Alberta. This land provides us with the sustenance, with the food sources, with the water sources, and also the cultural procurement that has made us who we are. When you take the word Dene, the name of our people, and you break it down into its root words, De or De means to flow. Ne means from the earth. We flow from the earth. That is who we are, and our central integral identity is directly connected to place and the natural world. We cannot separate the two, which is why our economic systems that predate current capitalist systems lived in harmony and existed in harmony with the natural world, and why so much of the world's biodiversity still is kept and safeguarded with Indigenous territories the world over. Let's think about Canada's economy. The foundations of Canada's economy started with the fisheries in the east, moving through agricultural lands, through the central and prairies, to the furs in the north, and of course gold mining in the west. I just didn't have enough room for 4 pictures, sorry. But we think of these. Now, one of the most interesting things about when we think of the foundations of Canada's economies is its white people working the land and being the hard workers. Similarly to this idea of men ruling the sort of working labor class, it was white folks. And we were simply sort of the smaller players. And so we look at these economic structures that were created in the foundations of Canada that didn't just disconnect Indigenous peoples from being a part of developing those economic systems, but it also came with the severing, the devaluing of Indigenous cosmological ideologies around connections to the land and the natural world. When European colonists came to the Americas, they didn't just come here to reap the bounties of the New World. They came here to extinguish the Indigenous peoples that were here so that they could support their ideologies of doctrine of discovery and terra nullius and man's dominion over nature. And so when we think about how we're going to look at new and emerging economies, we have to think about where that has gotten us. We now live in a country that is dominated by a petro-economy. Our economies have evolved, and we are still participants. Indigenous peoples are absolutely participants in every single one of these economies. That isn't to say that we fully support them, but we have become economic hostages and forced into these systems. So, this is Canada right now. This is the industrial sectors of the country. So I know that I come from the tar sands sector of northern Alberta, and let's just look at Alberta here for a second. What is happening here? I don't even know what to say sometimes when it's this, right? This is what is dominating our economies. Our communities are forced into these economic sectors, whether it was the fisheries and the overfishing of the East Coast, whether it was deforesting and creating monoculture crops in the prairies, to devastating the animals and the livestock, and not livestock, but the animals in the north through the fur trading industry. We are now decimating the entire ecological systems for tar sands and other oil and gas projects in this country. This is the foundations of the economies, and this is what happens when we sever our ideological perspectives of making money and being rich and bountiful, which is predicated on these ideologies of the colonial ideologies of man's dominion over nature, and moving away and demonizing our interconnectedness with the natural world. So just to give you an idea of how crazy it is, tar sands is crazy. They're insane. And we think that in this post-climate crisis world that we wouldn't be creating an industry that is producing more emissions, becoming the fastest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. Canada has this big plan called the Deep Decarbonization Plan that by 2050, all of Canada's emissions will be at 150 megatons per year. This industry is allowed to grow to 100 megatons a year. So 2/3 of the entire country's emissions will be considered the Alberta tar sands. These projects aren't just violating the rights of our communities, but they're putting us all in danger. And they're all predicated on the fact that we need this for Canada's economic growth. Even Trudeau has stated that no country would find 173 barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there. Unless, of course, maybe you had a different value systems that guided the principles of your economy. And First Nations have been at the forefront of challenging the drive to continue to extract oil and promote extractivism, but the government is saying they don't have the right. We don't have the right to protest, and that we cannot veto these things. So when we're talking about how we create value systems that guide our economies, we have to start thinking about what are the risks. We are in a climate crisis. And I already said this, but basically, here's the whole thing on where we live. And our landscapes as Indigenous people provide not just, we don't just provide steps to how to steward our lands and take care of our lands and create different economic systems, but our lands encompass and hold valuable ecological value to stabilizing the global climate crisis. And we're not thinking about that. And so when we think about the biodiversity of Canada, the biggest biodiverse region of the world is, does everyone know what this is? I can't hear you guys. Yeah, boreal forest. It's so big and beautiful. And look at it, it goes across all these different territories and regions. Saskatchewan, let's reframe that. Let's think about that territory. Who lives within these forests? There are over 600 Indigenous communities that live within Canada's Great Boreal Forest, which has great significant value if it is taken care of properly. That is the crux. Canada's boreal forest can provide valuable assets to addressing the global climate crisis while simultaneously allowing localized regional economies to thrive in Indigenous communities, or it can become a huge threat to the world. So climate change. It's terrible. We're all going to die. It's science facts. I'm not an academic. It's scary. Global climate change emissions were rising, and a lot of it is being driven by, as we talked about, the Anthropocene. Human activity is what's changing things. And when we look at the anthropological footprint of Canada, I wish I'd put the other map of the resource extraction or the industrial sectors of Canada. I'm like, oh, Alberta, what is happening? What is happening? That's a huge swath of the Canadian boreal forests right there as well. And again, these forests house not just valuable assets to ecological survival of the ecology and the biodiversity, but they serve as the home to so many Indigenous communities that had thriving economies pre-contact. And how do we pass on our knowledge that these economies are viable to our children when we are constantly told that when we stand up against these projects that we are criminals, that we are anti-development? This is my son, this little guy right here. He's learning how to play the drum with his cousin, AJ, right here. And this was at one of our camps at the Tar Sands Healing Walk, where we were talking about this industrialization as well as, our rights. And they seem at contradictions with one another. And we talk about, we are economic hostages within these structures, within these systems. We have to safeguard these beautiful places that hold so much rich value to protecting the natural world. And we are not doing it in the same way. When we think about the lungs of the earth, where do you all think of? This is the Amazon. Lungs come in pairs, okay? Who knows what this is? The boreal. The boreal forest and the Amazon forest provide great ecological value. And it's not just the ecological value and the similarity of the landscapes. They're very similar, by the way. I just went to Ecuador and Brazil recently, and I was astounded by the similarities of the ecological landscapes. But more so, I was astounded by the similarities of the people. I went there and I traveled with a young man named Nigel Henry Robinson, and when we landed in the community of Nimumbai in Ecuador, we got off the plane, we're shaking hands, we're hanging out, there's kids, there's elders, people running around, and Nigel just goes, "It's the res! It's the res of the South!" Except they can drink the water, and they can still eat the food. So we need to start not just looking at the ecological value of our ecosystems, but the human lives that are integrated with those, and the economic systems that can be associated if we protect and preserve not just the landscapes as an externality, but the people associated with those landscapes that have shown since time immemorial their ability to steward those lands while simultaneously growing economies. I don't need to do that. So the earth is out of balance. We're out of balance with ourselves, with Mother Earth, and in order to address the climate crisis, we must restore our relationship with Mother Earth and with each other and address the imbalances in all aspects of our lives. We are in a crisis where even the World Bank states that in order for the GDP to grow, we have to grow by 3% annually in order to sustain our economic systems. We have seen, if you remember that map, what economic growth looks like when it comes to the ecological footprint that it has on just our country alone. But it's not just the impacts on the climate. It's not just the impacts on the environment. It's the impacts on the localized economies. So this is from my territory. This is a portrait of 2 of the 1,608 ducks that landed on a tailings pond and all died in 2008. Since then, we haven't heard a lot of fanfare, but every year hundreds of ducks, migratory ducks, that fly through the region land in tailings ponds and die. It is such a problem that they now have created these big propane cannons that sit on these tailings ponds that are more like lakes, and they shoot and propel big loud booms on the land to scare the ducks from landing on the tailings ponds because they're so toxic. It's not just ducks either. There's, moose, caribou, bison, bears, other land mammals are going to these tailings ponds, which are often just not, they're just open. There's no fences blocking them. Wildlife can walk right in. These tailings ponds are also contributing to leaching of contaminants into our groundwater systems and entering into our river systems, which are further contaminating our fish. And we're seeing deformities, lesions, fish that are being pulled out with soft tissue that almost fall apart when you eat them. The same thing is happening to the caribou and the bison and the moose that we eat in the region. They're also being found to have, cancers and lesions on their bodies. And more so, even to that, is that we have broken down this psychological disconnection from the natural world to a point where we don't value the life. Our opening remark talked about respecting all the things. Our opening ceremony today from our local people talked about the respect of the trees and the fish and the wildlife and the birds. And this last picture over here is a beheaded bison. My people are bison and caribou people. That was the main source of sustenance. It was the main source that we traded amongst our people. The fish and the duck were also a main source of our economy. They sustained our people, not nurturing us just with food, but we were able to trade these goods amongst other communities. And what we've seen with this imposed economic structure of the extractivism through extracting tar sands in our region is a bunch of people that have no regard, no understanding of our history, our cosmological and ideological connections to the natural world, or the relevance that their species have to our stories, our origin stories. And we now have people poaching one of the last remaining bison herds in our region simply for the trophies of their heads. The story behind this photo is that we had 3 hunters in my community that were tracking this herd of bison, which at one point used to number in the thousands and now is 80. That's it. They were tracking this herd for days to try and hunt so that they could get 1 or 2, so they could provide food for the community. And when they came upon this bison, one of the hunters ran to it and said, maybe the meat is still good. And when he got to it, the meat had already gone bad, and he cried. He cried because he realized he could not save the meat for the family and for the community, but he also cried because of the complete disrespect and disregard for such a great creature that had such a deep significance to our people and our identities. Again, thinking about we had existing trade routes. We had existing economies that thrived in the Americas before colonization. And as we are trying to search for ways to address the climate crisis, we're still doing it within the confines of the very structures that have taken us there. We're still looking for solutions that are predicated on economic and capitalist solutions like green economies, when we could be looking and broadening the scope of looking at how we intersect and bring in Indigenous ideological perspectives and include Indigenous peoples in developing solutions that the greater community at large can replicate. And these solutions are not new. This is not a new idea. Indigenous peoples for decades have been raising the alarm bells on climate change. I was at this event in 2009 in Anchorage where we wrote the Anchorage Declaration that calls for much greater targets than the current pan-Canadian framework or many of the other frameworks that are being produced as an end product of the Paris Agreement. And our ideological perspectives and our safeguarding of ecosystems has been recognized by the UN, and it's further supported by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is predicated on free, prior, and informed consent. And I want to stress this because when we talk about in Canada, we get stuck on what I call the big C. We're constantly talking about, and it's been downgraded, it's not consent, it's consultation. But we're always like, okay, we've got all the plans, we're ready to go. Oh, wait, did we consult with the Indigenous community? Okay, make sure we get it to them, and then we'll ask them what they think. I can tell you in my own community that we are sometimes given volumes of reports to read, sometimes in the tens of thousands of pages, and we have 30 days to respond to them to determine whether or not it's in violation of our rights, in order to determine whether or not we get standing in a hearing within the regulatory process. That is not free, prior, informed consent. It is simply a downgraded process of consultation that does not give us free of coercion and intimidation. Again, our rights of Indigenous peoples have been upheld within the Paris Agreement. It's the first international convention that recognizes the deep need for respecting and integrating the rights of Indigenous peoples as well as our knowledge. And we have to absolutely not let our rights be negotiated. Our rights are not up for negotiation. So many of our communities are fighting for, want sovereignty, I should say. We want sovereignty and autonomy and control over our lands and territories to bring back those traditional forms of economics and land stewardship. But instead, we are simply fighting for the safety of our communities. We don't need that. But some of the really groundbreaking stuff is Indigenous. There's a new platform called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which is the first of its kind that we are allowing to have Indigenous people self-identify their representatives to help negotiate within the Paris, or the COPs and the UNFCCC systems to determine pathways for the implementation and technological advancements for implementing the Paris Agreement at state levels. And this is the first time it's happened where Indigenous people are going to be given a seat at the table. We're finally starting to get there, but we have to think about what does that look like? What do our solutions look like to the climate crisis? And they're not the same. They're not going to be, thinking about how we can reduce our red meat consumption, because in some of our communities, eating caribou and bison and moose is what has sustained us for years, and we don't even have the option of buying, big Burger King Big Macs or whatever it was in that ad. But it's about coming back to our natural sources of economics. This is from Dene Nawo at the urban hide tanning camp, where they're trying to bring this back, not just the techniques, but also these economies. We have wild rice reemerging in so many different places. We have fishing economies starting to reemerge, bringing back traditional preserving technologies and trading of this, but we're limited. And I also want to say that our technologies and what we're doing is not limited to just these pre-colonial ideologies, but we're looking at ways to support all of those systems with emerging modern technology that supports and is in line and in harmony with supporting, moving away from extractivism and protecting the sacredness of Mother Earth. But all of this comes down to the fact that we must find ways to honor the treaties, stop the destruction, and begin that process of healing, and looking at ways that we can decolonize. And decolonization in its simplest form is the return of and the connections to land. And I just want to end with Indigenous peoples, our cultures, our values, and our languages, and our knowledge systems connect us to the sacredness of Mother Earth. Our voices and solutions to critical to developing climate solutions, mitigation, and adaptation strategies that will benefit everyone. Thank you, Masicho.
Eriel, this was fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, so here we are. We have time for questions, discussion, and comments from everyone who's here.
I thought I would like to do a quick recap.
Okay.
Throw a couple of ideas, see whether you want to engage with them, and we can also open the floor for questions. So as a white heterosexual male, I feel that I should not intervene long. So I think that we've done it enough through history. So now our time is up. And I'm glad. And I'm glad that our time is up. But considering that some of us understand that toxic masculinity and the time of toxic masculinity is up, I would like to also ask a few things to both of you, Susan and Eriel, and of course Ellie. First, I hear both of you talking about a return to a different economy. You mentioned the Aristotelian term oikonomia. You talked about the possibility of reimagining our economies as not in opposition to societies, but economies as part of the socio-ecosystems. Economies that support and sustain life, not that predate on life. I hear in both of your presentations views about how racism, machism, has led to a marginalization and pain, not only social pain, but also environmental pain. Therefore, there must be a deeper reflection of our role in maintaining, supporting, and reproducing this system. And I'm talking about all of us, how we participate in the construction of this trap of manliness or this trap of capitalism as we know it now. So I would like to ask you, I would like to start asking you, well, I'm throwing this question first, which is, what do you consider are these symbolic elements that sustain and support a society that reproduces man as a bread provider, that supports the idea of this a minimal family, a heterosexual family as the unit for capitalist reproduction, and also one trap that marginalizes the other with capital O. So that is one. And my other question has to do, what about class struggle? As a Marxist, I heard, Susan, in your description when you said that men are not all equal, some are more equal than others. But in any case, you actually show that the distribution of income is also quite disparate within a male. And I would like to ask you too whether within different First Nations across in Canada, and coming from Latin America, I can attest that within Latin America that happens, that not every member is the same, and there are power struggles that need to be addressed if we really want to overcome these, overcome, I would say, to co-construct a different society. There's nothing to overcome, there's everything to destroy and co-construct. So that's about me. Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
You can start first. Go ahead.
Nico, I think you've said enough.
Thank you.
I don't need
I
to add
agree.
I don't need to add anything to that. I think those are all really thoughtful insights. Yeah.
Okay.
Class inseparable. Class, race, and gender evolved together in the capitalist scene in certain ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely classism exists, and particularly, I think it absolutely exists in Indigenous communities. We see it all the time emerge in a lot of our conversations around, corrupt leaders, embezzling money from the collective good of nations. We constantly are struggling with that. And I do think that within those structures, there is always this internal fight around how we dismantle those things. It's very difficult, I think, in this era where we have had hundreds of years of colonization and imposed value systems that are dictating our communities, including how we govern ourselves. That was part of the spoken word piece, is that our communities are told, you know, you need a chief, you need a councilman, you get this much money every year, then you got to do these things, and this is how you do it. That it perpetuates the models of classism within our own communities, which are being internalized, and we're dealing with the exact same things as everyone else. The ethnicity, gender, all of the things that you brought up, and economies are influencing and creating divisions in our communities. We're not insulated from any of that. We're still subject to all of those same sort of markers and indicators of disparities.
I heard in your question also a question about the transition path to somewhere better. And I heard you say that loud and clear in your presentation. And I heard Susan talk about that too. Through the route of addressing masculinities, we might be able to dismantle some of these, the way people have been alienated from themselves and from nature, and used as factors towards factors of production, right?
Yeah.
Turned into factors of production.
That's right.
But when you talk about some of us would like to believe that Indigenous people are stewards of the land, and returning the land to Indigenous people would solve the problems. And I heard you say, it's not that easy.
Well, obviously, it's not that easy. We live in Canada where there have been created legislative systems. Even the treaty agreements are in dispute over what they mean. Did we cede and surrender land to the colonial government when we signed those treaties? And again, the interpretation that prevails is the European colonialist interpretation of those treaties. And does that mean that we have relinquished that? I think that there are many communities that would dispute that, but there are others that say that we're working together. I don't think it's a cut and dry, but I do think that there has been really, really great headway being made on how the return of Indigenous lands to Indigenous communities does equate to better preservation of ecological systems and supports localized economies.
Yeah. Yes.
And so within the UNFCCC, there was the Green Climate Fund that was created, and within the Green Climate Fund, there was money earmarked specifically for Indigenous communities and looking at solutions of Indigenous communities. And that resulted in conversations around the return of particularly forest tenure. And in countries in Latin America and Asia where they'd experimented with this, they found that it did in fact correlate with increased stewardship of ecological systems and the emergence of regional and localized economies. There's a really great project called the Haku Initiative, which is in the Amazon, the Ecuadorian Amazon and the Peruvian Amazon, where these communities of women are now creating jewelry and all of these artisan facts that they're using to promote both the return of lands and ecosystem management to the communities, but also creating localized economies as a way to fight. And so there's plenty of examples of how it's successful. I think it's easier to have that conversation in a developing nation than a G7 country like Canada.
Well, Ronald Trosper's book talks about many examples in North America too. The return of the Kerr Dam.
Or the Haida Gwaii.
And the Haida Gwaii. There are so many examples, and Kyle Powys-White has documented a lot of examples too. But I think it's time to see if there's anyone in the out there who would like to make a comment or ask
We have
or
questions
intervene. We
here.
have questions from online.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Okay. So if you have questions, guys, you can ask for a paper or just write it on a piece of paper and then send it to us. So we have here 3 questions,
One
please.
at a time. One at a time.
Yes, I know. Trying to read it. Please, for both. Please speak to the unique experiences of politics and social movements on a multi-generational timescale. Decolonization and redefining masculinity are projects that may take lifetimes to fully achieve, compared to passing on a law on pay equity or stopping a pipeline.
Nice. Do you want to tackle
Go
some of that
ahead.
first?
Actually, I loved seeing the pictures of the little children playing the drum, and I really liked when Kelly and what was her son? Jacob. Kelly and Jacob came together, because it allowed us to actually be part of that moment of multi-generational learning and growing. And since I think producing humans is the most important thing, the most important mode of production we have going, we have a lot to experiment and explore on that level.
Yeah, I think that's a really big question. Was that you, Jody? No? Okay. Because you were like saying, that's a really big question. I think that, of course, these are huge, huge undertakings like decolonization and gender, addressing like toxic masculinity. These aren't things that are going to go away very easy. And I think that's a really good point. You can't just create a policy and make it go away poof, because they're socialized behaviors, they're norms, and sometimes it's hard for us to see these things. And this is a quote by some Marshall McLellan or something, but he says, "I don't know who discovered water, but I can tell you it wasn't a fish." And that is to say that we sometimes can't see what's right in front of us, right? We don't see the things that we're living in. So it's difficult for us to name and quantify and qualify issues when they are part of our natural environment all the time. And unfortunately, we've created capitalism, toxic masculinity, colonization are the socialized norms. And so how do we start to deconstruct them and pull them out is going to be difficult, because you have to make the fish see the water. And that's not something you can do through policy development, but it requires that intergenerational teaching. And that gets me into this idea of like storytelling versus the written word. And I was reading this interesting paper on how human evolution of communication has evolved through so many different processes, where we were like once without language and got to like writing symbols on walls to share things. And then we began to have spoken word, and we started to share our stories and our experiences, and our brain processing changed with storytelling. We heard stories, and it changed, and it grew our imaginations and helped develop our cerebral cortex. And then we developed the written word. But then we became so reliant, and we had this system that idolized the written word, and it was the only way. And we started to dump all of our knowledge into these great libraries and books, but there was no transmission of that knowledge to the oral history and storytelling. And so there is some indications that we lost some of our ability to process and understand our own history through that. So it's not going to be about writing the best paper. It's going to be about how we convey these messages through both a combination of the written word and oral history, which is emerging through new technologies with the emergence of like people on their Facebook Live telling and streaming and telling the stories while simultaneously writing news articles. And so this is the same fashion and approach that I think we have to address and look at the world. It's not one or the other. It's not the written word over oral history. It's oral history in combination with written words. It's combining technology to make all of those things come to life as one. And that's how we must approach these big systemic problems. There's no golden arrow. And we must work together and collectively to try and figure out how we can make that fish see the water.
Probably what people will remember most about your presentation was the Flintstones to the Jetsons. I mean, what better than to see the water of the nuclear family than to have those pictures?
That seemed to tell us that it transcends time and culture. That's the only option.
Yeah.
So, Eriel, question for you. What does Indigenous sovereignty look like? Do you need the larger Canadian government for anything?
Do we need it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, first off,
Great question.
what does Indigenous
Yeah.
sovereignty look like? We're not pan-Indigenous, and Indigenous sovereignty looks different no matter where you are. So I don't know what it looks like. It's varied, it's multifaceted. Some communities are matriarchal, some are not, some have hereditary. I don't know. I think in the very foundations and basics of it is it would hold up tenets of self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. And that is the basic foundation of it, and it would allow communities to determine for themselves beyond the jurisdiction of that tiny little dot on the map of the reserve in which we've been forced onto. And so that is Indigenous sovereignty. It could become in co-management, it could become in like autonomous regions that are completely separate, and I can't tell or determine what that would look like. We have to make room for those conversations and respect the autonomy of those communities in creating that. But again, as I said in my presentation, we tend to get stuck. Our communities are constantly trying to fight these extractive or violent forms of economies that we're constantly stuck in the battle of just safety and survival, rather even being able to establish what sovereignty looks like for us.
Susan, how are new production technologies going to change the concepts of masculinity and manliness? Production technologies are going to change concepts of masculinity and manliness. I was very keen when you mentioned Facebook and so, and I don't know, I don't think Facebook is challenging any of that, but in any case, the question is for you, Susan.
It can. I think economies, identities change with means of communication. We had some beautiful examples of technological change, from pictographs to language to writing, that change the ways in which knowledge is owned and moves around. And so I think those will really, there's no doubt that will change the gender possibilities. Another thing I would like to believe is possible in terms of communication technology is thinking about Nico's question of recuperating maybe some old and dispersed ways of life and co-constructing futures, is that maybe new communications technology supports us to move more towards pluriverse, where we don't have to find the next economic model that works. I think we have all of us spend a lot of time criticizing the particular economic, social, gender model that I criticize, right? It's not so much the problem that that's bad in itself. The problem is that it's come to penetrate so much of the world. Eriel said that even among Indigenous people, who are only 5% of the world's population, there's 5,000 languages. So that ethno-linguistic diversity allows all kinds of technologies of communication, of gender, of production to coexist and be reproduced that can't really pass because linguistic difference shapes different worlds. And so I'm hoping that that's where it can go in a more pluriversal future for
But Susan, if I can do a follow-up on that, I think that the idea of technology having ownership, I think that the crucial element that you touched upon is, for instance, a open access and sharing of knowledge that now we know, and as academics we know it even more, that we, like, all of a sudden our articles cannot be openly shared because because publishers sent us emails saying, don't share the knowledge that we created, that we co-created.
They own it, yeah.
So, and on top of it, I think that how is that technology being reproduced? Who controls and who can reproduce it? Because one picture that you showed with the solar panels, are we able to construct the solar panels within the community? With the materials of the community?
No.
Or what are the effects of?
I mean, of course, renewable energy it's not a perfect science, but that I love your point. It's not to say that all extraction is bad. It's like how we do it. It's the value systems that govern extractivism and our energy systems that has become a problem. It's that moral disconnection of our relevance and our place on the planet as part of ecosystems. Like, we are a part of ecosystems. Like, let's get this straight. We talk about protecting biodiversity as if humans are not a part of the biodiversity. I think the language and the linguistic differences is such a great example of biodiversity of humans. And I think about the map of of all the different Indigenous people of Canada, the Indigenous trading routes. Those people had hundreds of different languages that existed just in the continent of North America, and yet they were still able to trade across economic routes. Look at the EU that has these tiny little countries with their own languages, their own governance and their own system, and yet we don't want to even talk about that in the continent of North America or reinstate the values of those different culturals and language and linguistics and governance fashions. But the reality is we need biodiversity, not just of the, separate world, but of all living organisms, including humans on planet Earth. Ethnobiodiversity.
So the following question has to do with this. Can you share insights about how knowledge from traditional indigenous economies might help with sustainability solutions for challenges that stem from concentrations of people in large urban centers who depend on food produced elsewhere? Or, well, you can have it even as a broader question of.
Again, it's just as diverse. It's such a diverse answer. There's so many different ways in which Indigenous knowledge has changed and emerged and morphed economic systems. I do think Haida Gwaii has a really great example. Haida Gwaii had massive deforesting of old growth trees for generations, like decades, and there was a lot of opposition from the Haida Gwaii, and then the Haida Gwaii took everything to court, and Haida versus the Crown. And sort of what happened is since the court decision, there's been this emergence and this reinstating of Indigenous traditional governance within Haida Gwaii. And that has also changed the economy. Now, not everyone benefited from that, and there's a lot of the people that were, clear cutting and making a lot of money clear cutting that had to sell their homes and leave the islands because they were not able to sustain that economic model. But that isn't to say that no economic model exists in Haida Gwaii. There is an economic model. It's just a sustainable economic model that sustains both the ecosystem and the local people. It doesn't, put money into the pockets of whatever the big logging industry was, which was the corporation. So how do we change the values of increasing profit margins of corporations and increasing the well-being of communities?
You can look to the Six Nations Reserve here to see a lot of great examples of how community development and financial investment, but from the perspective of sharing the common bowl, is working, right? And not unfailingly working. Sometimes there are 2 steps forward and 1 step back, just like with all of us, right? But there are many examples everywhere you look, and it points up to me why we need more academics pursuing ecological economics from an Indigenous frame, and more partnerships between ecological economists and Indigenous peoples and communities in the areas where they're doing research, so that to think about these things in the ways that Eriel is talking about.
Yeah, I think on that note, I'm in this online Facebook conversation, technology, around plastics in our clothing and unsustainability, even in emergence of Indigenous artisan work. We use plastic beads and we use polyester ribbons and all these materials. And we were talking about how do we go back to our traditional materials. And someone was like, if you do that, you're going to kill all the buffalo and all the moose and all the caribou, and we're going to have nothing left. And I was just like, I think that there are sustainability models, and it's just around readjusting. Like, I don't think we'd get there. He's like, look what happened to the bison. I was like, are you serious? Because the bison were not killed because native folks wanted to build buffalo robes. It was a policy to eradicate indigenous people. But we have this misconception that indigenous economies and indigenous lifestyles will take us backwards. And I think that is the common misconception, that we're going to go back to, people are like, oh, you want to take us back to living in teepees and communicating by smoke signals? And I'm like, no, not at all. I like my cell phone. You know? So how do we have that conversation in a real way, and highlight some of these really great examples is going to be what's needed. And, you know, Bill Nye, the science guy's book is called Everything at Once. And that's really where we need to be. We need to be everywhere at once, doing everything in all things. It's not about one being the best answer. Haida Gwaii solution is not the solution for the Mi'kmaq, or the, you know, Delaunay, or so on and so forth.
I think that we also need to recognize that we live in a dynamic, non-linear, evolving system. Hence, our initial conditions will highly affect the potential pathways that we will follow. That sense, there's a question here about ecological restoration. Ecological restoration, especially ecocultural restoration, are goal-driven intentional processes to change the trajectory into the future with references to the past. But these processes recognize you cannot return to the past. How does the idea of restoration make sense to you? And this is ecological restoration. We can talk about political and social restoration too in other terms. But the idea of restoration makes sense to you in regards to how we should address our current crises. For the three of you, please, colleagues.
That's tough. It's a really tough question.
Yeah, the questions have been wide, good, quite difficult though.
I think ecological restoration is necessary in a lot of different places, but I don't know if it's, you know, science has proven that we can't go and restore, particularly if I think about my region. I like to speak about where I come from because that's what I know the most, but like tar sands extraction has left our ecological landscape heavily damaged, and there have been numerous scientific reports now that have stated that restoration or reclamation of the pre-existing ecosystems is not possible. And a lot of that is because of the length and time in which those ecological systems needed in order to be created. So in my territory, we have peatlands, peat bogs, we call them muskegs. And the muskegs are tens of meters deep in some regions. Those took thousands of years because they're largely lichen, and they took thousands and thousands of years to become tens of meters deep. You remove that, there's no way to restore that. You need millennia to restore that. And so when we talk about restoration, I don't think we're talking about going back to a time, but we're talking about restoration of value systems that actually will lead to an ecological restoration and a reharmonization of human interactions with ecology. I think we need to reframe what ecological restoration is in order to get to that point. I don't think we can actually go back to something the way it was, but it's taking modern technology to help, you know, give it a little boost, to restore and reclaim lands, but recognizing that we have to readjust our relationships with the ecology in order to get there.
I think that's why the question was also framed as ecocultural restoration. I took the liberty of editing it a bit, which was wrong. But Susan,
right.
I think that you addressed part of this issue during your presentation when you talked about the impossibility to separate the symbolic from the biophysical, and you are actually calling for a restoring a symbolic element that we forgot, and that symbolic element may lead to a biophysical reality. So what is your view about that?
Yeah, good call. I think, I do believe everything in human worlds is biophysical and cultural, social. And I think some of the prayers we heard in honor today made that very clear. When I was thinking about this restoration word, one way to think about it is maybe eco-social regeneration, which has the cyclical idea of regenerating, reproducing, without the idea of going back to something in the past.
Leanne Simpson talks about resurgence.
Yeah, resurgence.
Resurgence.
Yeah.
I also think that I get really troubled by this idea that we're going to go back to something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about that.
And like when I think about Indigenous culture, and even like there's a really great example of like through Indigenous fashion around how Indigenous culture is not static. Like
Right.
we're not static people. Our culture evolved over time, and so we're not going to go back to like go. Oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pick the era between 1100 and 1150.
Oh, those
and like-
pointy
Yeah.
skin dresses.
Yeah, I like that one. I'm going to go for that cultural practice at the time. Like human evolution happened everywhere, and so to think that we're going back to something, I think we're talking about incorporating values of the past into the common and modern world. This is a big conversation we're happening within the track of Indigenous feminisms. And what does Indigenous feminism mean when some of our cultures in some of Indigenous communities were not supportive of of feminist ideologies as they exist now? And so how do we bring indigeneity and Indigenous cosmology into the conversation and discourse around feminism? That is to recognize that we are not static.
Nice.
And so we're not returning to something from long ago past. We're reimagining a future that actually includes us. That's to break it down, Indigenous people are just trying to reimagine a future that includes our vision and ideologies and values within the frameworks of a new emerging economies, all the things, solutions to the climate crisis, everything.
Nico, I'm worried about the time.
I think
Can
that that's why there was a bit of music on the background. I think that
The
the
dancing
lights will
girls.
shut down quickly.
Do we have to stop, or can you
We have
summarize?
to
Yeah?
We have to stop.
We have to stop. Oh,
So, thank you so much. Thank you. This is the beginning of the conversation. We will have many days, some days ahead of us. Please, I guess that the audience will feel free and address some of the questions that we weren't able to convey to you. Thank you so much for your time and for your great insights. Thank you.